All right, so what do we check when we're trying to problem solve? So first thing, this is the part I just added, the environment. There are lots of things that you can check, but in general, is the environment conducive? I think that's so conducive to learning. Are there things that you can put away? So for example, if I'm working with a learner and they're just bouncing from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, and I can't get them to stay with me for anything, then maybe can I put everything up? Can I put it in a closet or put it in a bin and then I hold it? Are there things that I can restrict access to so that then I can get some engagement? And that may be really important, especially in the beginning, either with the learner being very new or you being new to that learner to really kind of establish things. And we talked about how that is definitely more of a discrete trial version of how to get instructional control versus the naturalistic version, being that you would pair yourself with a lot of the things that they are already engaged in. So maybe doing a combination of both, but for some of our learners, they might need that more restricted access version initially to kind of get started. So limit the distractions, since some of the stuff that you guys brought up is along the lines of, well, I can't necessarily control how other people in the environment are going to respond. Maybe you could address it with a pre-correct, especially, I would say especially if there's a written program where you can reference, or something where you can pull out, hey, I just got this email from, you know, the consultant and she wants me to try it this way today. So, so can you help me out? You know, can you let me run this and I'll let you know when we're ready to move on to the next one like we normally do, or we want to try this thing with the feeding or with the mealtime routine. So, so here's how I'm going to try to do that today. Does that work for you? And then at least that way you've attempted to address it and remind them up front. And then if you need to, you can reference that again in the moment. So mom comes down to try and help. They're like, oh, remember we're doing this new version, this new program. Oh yeah. All right. So then the next thing we want to look at is data. Now, in the case of something, there are going to be some things that I say probably aren't being captured by data, and that's okay. That's in here. So, but we also want to check and make sure that you are recording the data correctly. So, especially if we're talking about programs and progress, that you are accurately recording what you're doing, so that you're if it's supposed to count as a different kind of a prompt, or if the criteria says that that counts as a correct under these conditions, that you're recording that correctly so that you're recognizing whether or not this is a success or whether or not this is still a prompt, that you're recognizing all of that, and we're taking data correctly. So what can you do? You can ask for an IOA observation, ideally with the consultant, but I am going to put a little caveat that, like, if you're here in the preschool, there are other people that are doing the same thing that you could probably check in with, but ultimately we'd want to make sure that everybody is checked back with the consultant. The reason that I always say that we want to the data is because that's what I'm asking you for, you know, like, well, what's going on? So you want to make sure that you're accurately reporting on what's going on. So whether that is a written description in ABC data, or like we practice, or the actual numbers, or the next question is the data reflecting the concern? Is there data for what you have? Because sometimes people have definitely come to me and it's like, okay, so it's not really on the data, but here's what I'm seeing. And like, great, you know, we don't know to take data on something unless somebody says that, hey, this might be a concern. So then we can go and we can look at it. So that's why I say, like, some of these things, as far as you know, you may already be doing the data correctly, or the data doesn't exist, and that's the part that you need help with because you're like, I think there's an issue, but I don't know. So tell us about it so that we can figure out a way to record it. The other thing that I want you to do before we get to reinforcement, but reinforcement is definitely in there, is to double check yourself as to whether you are running the program as you are supposed to. If I go and I do an observation with somebody, I'm looking at their data, their IOA. Are they actually reporting? Because here's the thing. Actually, I'm going to back up a sec. So if I look at a graph, because that's normally how I'm going to see a problem. If I look at a graph and the data is really variable, right? I'm like, okay, what's going on with this data? The first thing I want to check is make sure that we're all counting things correctly. We're all recording the same thing and we're all counting those items the same way. Then I want to make sure that we're all actually running the program that we say we're running, so that I know whether or not the problem is with the program or with our implementation of it. We should always be checking ourselves first before we look at the learner, because if we can change the environment, if we can be more proactive, if we are running programs the way they're written and correctly and things like that, then we're setting the child up for the best opportunity for success, and then we can shift focus back on the learner. So I always start with what can I do to change it first, make sure I'm doing everything the way that I'm supposed to be doing before I start looking about what does the learner need to change, or what can I change for the learner. So reread the program, ask clarifying questions, ask the consultant to come and observe you run that program. Now, obviously, with doing the IOA and doing the fidelity checks, that's going to require some scheduling to have somebody come out. So that may not be something that you can do in that moment, but you should be able to check the way that the program is written and just double check and make sure, okay, that is a spoken prompt. I am doing this correctly. Okay. Now, what's the next step? So then that's when I want to look at reinforcement. First of all, are you using a reinforcer? Just because something might be preferred and they might choose something does not mean that it's going to be a reinforcer. So we do have to make sure that we're assessing things. You can conduct another preference assessment. Sometimes if you're doing a forced choice preference assessment, you pick 2 items and sure, they pick one, but they don't really care. So it might be helpful to, okay, let's take a break. What do you want to play with? And see what they go to. And then maybe you can capture that and use that as a reinforcer. But you need to make sure that you have something that is preferred. Ideally, that's slightly restricted access, or that you are, I didn't write it in here, pairing yourself. Da, da, da. I will add this too. So do you have a reinforcer? See what they go to. And then are you reinforcing according to the appropriate schedule of reinforcement? Ideally, the program would specify. I'm going to be honest and say that probably it's not written into all the programs, but it should be, so you can ask us and we can add it. Generally speaking, you should be reinforcing new skills more frequently than mastered skills, because those are new ones that you're working on. Because they're new, that's why. Because they're not in their repertoire yet. You should be reinforcing attending behaviors. If every time the kid comes to the table, we give them work, why on earth does the kid want to come to the table? Sometimes we need to just come to the table. Hey, there's a token, or great job coming to the table. Let's get up and go play again. You know, it's going to depend upon your learner, but but capturing some of those opportunities to reinforce the attending skills, the attending behaviors that we want to maintain as well. And then in general, we want to reinforce independent skills more intensely than prompted skills. So I don't want to say more frequently, because there are definitely learners where we are still reinforcing prompted skills, especially as you are fading your prompts out. But if they do it independently, that should be a much bigger deal, a better reinforcer, better praise, maybe longer time, because that is more valuable. And we want to differentially reinforce independent or better responding over those prompted trials. So then what you should do is double check and make sure, okay, am I reinforcing this right thing? I have something that they're motivated by. I have something that they like. Am I delivering it on a schedule that's, supporting the appropriate behavior? As an example, if you have the kid come and you're doing a receptive task, touch dog, and they touch dog, and you go to give them their bubbles, and you say, great, you got your bubbles, say bubbles, bubbles, and then you hand them the bubbles. Have you reinforced touching dog? No, you've reinforced that. Yeah, you've reinforced the spoken, which is also important and may also be a skill, but you have to make sure that you are also reinforcing this skill that you're also working on. So sometimes you just give them the bubbles and they don't have to say it because they earned it this way. And then sometimes maybe they get the bubbles and then you pause and then you have them say bubbles for the next one or whatever, right? That you're like, well, I wonder why they're not making progress with this. Oh, well, because they've actually not contacted reinforcement nearly as often for that. And then the part that I meant to write but didn't write, you should be looking at yourself and working on becoming a conditioned reinforcer or building rapport. So, so I think we've gone over it with everybody, but the PRIDE rules, so praising appropriate behavior, reflecting their vocalizations or their statements, imitating their play, so following their interest, describing, so not asking questions, but actually just describing and commenting and engaging with them. And then E, being enthusiastic or energetic, not too much, because some of our kids don't want too much. You got to match to the learner there, but making it look like you're having fun, even if maybe you're not. So making sure you're identifying a reinforcer, but also if you know today's an off day, maybe you spend more time. So spend some more time building rapport or maintaining rapport in your session if you know that it's possibly going to be a rough day, or if you're seeing that it's already a rough day, okay, we're going to take a break and we're going to play and we're going to see if we can get some momentum going by increasing our rapport. All right, so then if we've looked at those things, then the next thing we want to look at is prerequisites. Now, you may or may not be able to tell, but if you've worked with the learner for a while, you probably worked on some of the prerequisites in their program, or you've seen some skills displayed in a different condition. So let's say, for example, that our learner is, we're going to say our skill is sitting at the table for work, and we are not seeing progress. We feel like we're not able to fade out our prompts, or there's disruptive behavior that's occurring right before or during those tasks that require sitting at the table. And so we want to assess whether or not they have the prerequisites to meet this goal of, let's say, sit at the table for 5 minutes, right? I don't know. I'm just making stuff up here. You might see, okay, well, what if they're doing a preferred activity? Are they able to sit at the table for 5 minutes if it's just free play, right? So it's, in that case, then we're looking more about it being, it's not a skill deficit, it's a motivational deficit, right? If they have something they like, they can demonstrate the skill. So if we were doing fine motor tasks and and there's a fun activity that requires them to use the pincher grasp, and they're doing that to get the little puff balls out of the tube or whatever. But then when we do it in a more structured activity, they're grabbing things like this, then maybe we need to look at motivation, or is there a different way to get at this skill? Versus if they are not able, it's like, even it's a preferred activity and they're still, stand up and wiggle and move and, get up and go and get something else. Like, okay, even with everything that they want right here, they still can't sit for 5 minutes. Okay, then that is more of a skill concern. We'd also want to look at what their mastered skills are, especially if you've worked with them, or you should be able to see it on Portia Pro when they're in math maintenance and generalization. Run some of those and see if they're still able to perform those at criteria. So if we are moving to, I can't think of something off the top of my head where the skill would be more different, but let's say like we're working on reading and they previously mastered letter sounds. Go back, review some of the letter sounds, make sure they're still remembering all their letter sounds. Great, they do. So now we know that we're not maybe jumping too far ahead. But if they've forgotten some of their letter sounds, then it's going to be really hard to work on reading because this skill has not maintained or is not generalized. Okay? So if you saw, and what we're talking about here too is that, like, if there's a, if the prerequisite is the problem, that maybe they didn't generalize it, or we took too big of a step to the next level, or it just didn't maintain because there was too much of a gap between when they mastered this and when they went on to the other one. So after we look at all these things, we want to kind of see if we can determine, is this a skill deficit or a motivational issue? So if they're able to perform the task but under other conditions, we're probably talking about motivation. Although I've definitely had some learners where it was generalization, and the generalization itself was the piece that was difficult. So it was the skill deficit was generalizing, not motivation. Like they could be using the same reinforcers at school, but they still weren't getting the same results. Rule out medical or other reasons. Because the thing is too, if we talk about like toilet training, I'm gonna use toilet training as an example. If an individual has like a UTI, it's going to be very difficult to be successful with toilet training at that moment. So you'd want to, but you don't want to blame it on the kid for not learning when they're actually dealing with a medical condition.
Don't have that like sensation that they need to